You're listening to the Today's Family Lawyer podcast, the leading source of daily news and insight for family law practitioners in England and Wales. Sign up to our free weekly newsletter at todaysfamilylawyer.co.uk and subscribe to hear all the latest news and views from across the family law sector. You can also follow us on LinkedIn and Twitter.
Hello, welcome along to the latest Today's Family Lawyer podcast. Today I'm joined by Paul Hunter. Paul is the Technical Director at Forensic Testing Service, and Sarah Branson, a barrister at Coram Chambers, specialising in children's law. And the topic of discussion today is drug testing, bit of an unusual one, definitely, and the sort of direction of travel is around the kind of tests that we need to be thinking about as family lawyers, and sadly, an issue that I suspect you come across all too often, Paul.
Yes, certainly my experience in the sector since I joined it about 14 years ago seems to be a very poor understanding of how to even instruct this evidence, let alone then consume it and know what it all means. And I think the other problem that is increasingly worrying me is that the evidence isn't being challenged and isn't being challenged appropriately. And I think that's because this evidence is not well understood. So these are the problems I face most of the time, and really why I'm spending so much time out there training so that people understand what they're getting involved in.
So an interesting topic. Hopefully we can do a bit of education, bust a few myths today. My first question to you both, I've done a very, very brief introduction to you, but Sarah first, would you mind telling us a little bit about yourself and your work and what you do at Coram Chambers?
Yes, so I'm a self-employed barrister at Coram Chambers. I'm instructed on a full range of family matters concerning children, with a particular emphasis on public law proceedings. That is when local authorities bring cases to court to remove children to seek public law orders, the most draconian of which could be adoption, obviously, which permanently severs the relationship between the child and the birth family. In those sorts of cases, drug use is often a relevant factor. The impact of a person's drug use on their parenting is often why local authorities bring cases to court. And then it becomes very important to know what someone's historical drug use is, and often, crucially, whether they have managed to address those difficulties such that they can safely parent their children.
And Paul, if you would do the same, please. A little bit about yourself and your role at Forensic Testing Service, please.
Most of my time, I suspect, is probably spent between going to court and training of all those involved in instructing and consuming this evidence, predominantly to local authority lawyers, the private and public law lawyers, the barristers, chambers and judiciary. The delivery of the reports and the development of the way in which we produce and deliver reports, I get involved in too, more at a development level nowadays than actually writing reports, although I'm probably consumed some of my time in the more complex cases, particularly the child cases. Increasingly, we seem to be testing children from literally within a few weeks of birth all the way through, and evidence from this work is proving to be pivotal in some of these cases, and clearly it's an area less is known about. We've been doing that for about 7 or 8 years, and it's something that we're developing and learning all the time. So yeah, it's a very interesting field, but it's one that hasn't really developed in the way it should have done over the past 20 or 30 years. We seem to be a bit stagnant in terms of the understanding of the evidence.
An emotionally and morally challenging area of the law as well. It didn't strike me that, of course, you would be testing children because of the impact that parents' drug use on children has. So let's dive right into the education piece then. Paul, tell us a little bit about drug testing. What's the process? At what point do you get engaged? And how does that then feed into the work of somebody like Sarah?
We generally get involved, certainly historically, and up to within a few years ago, it would be a lawyer who had been allocated either one of mother, father, or indeed the child to look after their interests. It would be in proceedings, and therefore a concern may have been already generated in terms of substance misuse, presenting a potential risk to the child in various guises, and therefore the court would order testing to be carried out on both parents, perhaps partners, whoever. The way in which that evidence is instructed typically is that they would simply instruct a drug test. So within the order, it would come down to drug testing, and they would just fairly prescriptively give you 3 or 4 lines in terms of, we want this person to test for cocaine, we'd like to cover 3 months, and we'd like it month by month, or we'd like an overview. Very simplistic. And it's been, I think, instructed that way for, well, since I came into the industry anyway, 14 years ago. That's normally how we get engaged. Those who we have been working with for longer and can now see the challenges of this particular type of evidence are moving more towards the instruction of an expert to enable the expert to assess the case and determine whether or not this evidence is likely or unlikely to assist in a case, because clearly it's costly, it takes time, there's significant time pressures on the court presently, particularly with the relaunch of the PLO. They're trying to get, from going into proceedings to completion of the case is now restricted to 26 weeks. So if this evidence gets instructed in the court, and certainly later on in the proceedings, then it's often too late to do the right thing, or indeed it's often not instructed because quite simply it will delay the process. So the challenges I guess we face are this rather what I would call draconian way of the courts or indeed the barristers such as Sarah, who may be involved in influencing the instruction of the evidence, or the lawyers. They seem to instruct the expert on what the expert should do, which is a little odd. In other areas of expertise, they would normally engage an expert for them to tell them how they would go about identifying particular issues. A psychologist, for example, or it could be a paediatric surgeon or whoever. It could be a whole range of other expertise. And unfortunately, and for whatever reason, the toxicologist seems to have been pigeonholed as a drug tester and not an expert. And I think this is what leads to so many issues in the courts. I've attended court now well over 100 times in cases where they shouldn't need an expert at all. The problem is they've bought a drug test. Nobody knows what it means, and various lawyers will argue their side, and the others will argue their side. Fundamentally, the evidence is not sound, and therefore can mislead proceedings, and it costs money. So what we're trying to do, we're going right back to basics. We try and engage now with lawyers up front. We need to know about the case. We get as much information as we can. We'll guide them as to what investigation and testing should be done. Make sure it's going to answer the appropriate questions that are being posed in the case and by the court, gather the appropriate context, etc., etc. And we act as experts in these cases typically. And that's where it works very well. But unfortunately, still the majority of cases are instruct drug test. And I think that's an area that I've been on a little bit of a mission, if you want, to try and change the way in which this evidence is instructed, get a better understanding of the evidence. And then when the likes of Sarah is standing there wondering whether or not this evidence is reliable and whether it supports or sinks her client, then they need to be fully armed with the knowledge to be able to challenge that particular case and the evidence in that case appropriately.
I'm going to throw to you, Sarah, now. So what point do you kind of get involved? How does the testing element impact your role? And then sort of the supplementary question is what Paul's talking about the expertise and the importance of the expertise to you.
I'm only become involved in a case when I'm instructed to attend court, but these drug testings are often commissioned during the pre-proceeding stage PLO if drugs are an issue. And then if the results are concerning, then the local authority will often then issue the proceedings for care or supervision orders. And it's at that stage when we're going to court that I become involved. Paul is absolutely right. The difficulty is that we have these drugs tests that say positive, negative. Sometimes they even say high, low or medium. And those are often taken at face value by the court, despite a line of authorities that say you need to look at drug results in context. You cannot say this is the science, follow the science, because we know, and we'll probably come on to discuss, that it's a very rapidly evolving field, and things that we thought provided some certainty 5 years ago now suggest a very different picture. So my role is to look at the drug results that we have, perhaps pre-proceedings, to take the client's instructions on whether they accept what they say. And if they don't accept what they say, to look to see if there is a better way to ensure that certainly that part of the case is properly evidenced by asking the right questions. Obviously, when we get to the end of proceedings, it becomes even more important, if you have a drug result that is not accepted by a client, to properly challenge that result, because too many people just accept what is provided for in the results and don't challenge them. And it's really through a case that I did earlier in the year where all the experts were against us, the guardian was against us, this child was going to be adopted because of a drug result that my client didn't accept. I cross-examined not Paul but a different expert, and as a result of that, that child went home to the father's care and is now happy and thriving in his care rather than being adopted. So really the message that I, with Paul, want to put out is, it is not an exact science. It is so far from being an exact science. And in many respects, it's quite unfair. I think when we come on to talk about difficulties with hair strand testing, we'll be able to give some examples of just quite how unfair it could be. But yeah, my role is to question, to challenge, to not accept a result if the client doesn't accept it's consistent with their reported drug use, and to try and make sure that these results are seen as they are and not as some kind of definitive answer, and not that it's the science, which I've heard said too often in court cases.
We're going to talk very specifically about hair strand testing. Yes, you're right. And I know there's a case that we're going to kind of explore around that. If we can take an analogy from sport, Paul, allow me that little sideways step. There's lots and lots of examples in sport where drug testing is very murky, and we're not quite sure whether somebody has or hasn't taken performance enhancing drugs, as an example. We get the same issue here, do we, where we're not really very sure, the science isn't particularly black and white about drug testing?
They are very different fields, I have to say, but yes, I mean, at a certain level, there are uncertainties. The uncertainties are for different reasons, I think, in both those. But fundamentally, as far as the court's concerned, yes, this isn't necessarily definitive evidence. And I think it's a very good point, because the expert has a very important role here, and that is that it isn't binary. This evidence isn't just in the bin or you make a decision on it. This is where there needs to be a very significant shift, if you like, in the way in which the evidence is communicated, because at the moment it is considered in both fields that you've mentioned there, obviously in the sport as well. Everybody wants a definitive, have they or haven't they? If the evidence isn't definitive in one direction, then often it therefore has failed, and consequently is not necessarily used. And I think the way in which this type of evidence, when it is complex and there's a lot of influences and contexts and histories, etc., come into play with regards to an outcome, as to what all those factors, including the testing, are likely to represent, then the way that evidence needs to be presented is just that. At best, in any event, this type of evidence is based on standard of proof for the court, which is balance of probabilities. So it isn't definitive, it's not beyond reasonable doubt, etc. But on that basis, what the consumer needs to understand is how compelling it is. Statistically, from all the work we've done previously, we should be able to provide the consumer of the evidence, in this case the court, with a balanced presentation of that evidence. So yes, it's likely that this person has used this particular drug between here and here. However, there is another possible explanation considered presently less likely. It could be explained by this other factor. And at that point, we can then advise the court as to, well, what would be the next steps in terms of testing, if further testing is required, if further information is required, if medical information is required, and if further testing is going to be carried out, what would be carrying it out? Would it be on a nail? Would it be on further hair samples? And if so, when? It's a much more structured approach. And I think the big gap, and the reason it doesn't happen at the moment, is that data has not been collected with each of these cases when testing is carried out. So every time we get a conflict, they can't return to anything that makes it different to what they expected, because they haven't got the context or the influences that affected each individual case. And I think that's where the industry really do need to wake up. And now that for the last 20 or so years that we've understood that things like hair colour and ethnicity and whether you wash your hair a lot or don't wash your hair at all, a whole range of factors will have a significant impact on what we see in there and what it means. And that's not an easy challenge. It's a very significant one. It's taken us 10 or 11 years of a huge investment to get to where we are at the moment. So, but I think the outcome of that is that this evidence can at least be judged then in the context of other evidence.
Presumably, the lines between black and white are exactly where the barrister wants to be, Sarah. I have my tongue firmly in my cheek when I say that.
Yes, well, it's the job of the barrister to, run the case on the instructions of the client. And if the client is saying these results are wrong, then it's your job to find out why they might be wrong. My concern is that the results are often taken by the court, even though they're presented on the balance of probabilities with more certainty than they should. Even when we look at the state of the current scientific knowledge, it's always open that in the future that we might discover something that meant that those results were not safe. An example of that is before 2019, there was a marker in hair, AEME. I mean, I'll defer to Paul on the science if I'm getting this wrong, that was taken as being a positive association with crack cocaine use. So before 2019, if you had this substance in a drug result, even if a client said, I have never taken crack cocaine in my life, but I, use a bit of cocaine recreationally, for example, then the drug results would say this person has used crack, or on the balance of probability, this person has used crack. Then we have a study in 2019 which demonstrates that the AEME is created when cocaine is associated with heat. So thermal hair straighteners, other treatments that use heat on hair cause this byproduct. And I can tell you that there are cases before 2019 where children will have been adopted because the court has found that crack cocaine use has been present. Crack cocaine is often far more concerning than recreational powder use. And here we see a development in scientific knowledge impacting quite significantly on the outcome of cases potentially. So there's what we know, and there's a lot that we know that's wrong with current systems of testing, and there's the things that we don't know. It is a very new field, and it's crucial that lawyers understand that drug results, drug testing should not be taken in isolation. And what is most crucial is how does this impact on parenting? Sometimes that's lost. Sometimes you say this person uses heroin and therefore they can't parent. Well, they might use heroin, but does it impact on their parenting? How does it impact on their parenting? Can there be safeguards in place? What is their level and frequency of usage? Is it managed in a way that means that the other parent can step in? There are all sorts of things to consider, and the drug testing needs to be looked at in the wider context. And very often that's what's missed. And that is what the authorities consistently say. You must not look at drug results in isolation.
I want to move on to talk very specifically about hair sampling and this issue that we've talked about in the run-up to the recording here, where different hair colours, different ethnicities, as you've said, Paul, and all sorts of other wider issues can potentially impact results. This has had its day in a recent case that you were working on, Sarah.
That's right. It was the case that I referred to earlier, where the parenting otherwise was good, but there was evidence of crack cocaine use, we were told, in the report. My client was Afro-Caribbean. He had dreadlocked hair that had been heat treated. He absolutely denied any cocaine use at all. The conclusion from that the experts who assessed him drew was that he was using drugs and lying about it. You can't risk assess unless someone is honest. That was the conclusion. They were saying we can't ameliorate this risk because he's lying to us. I did quite a lot of research, probably went beyond that which a barrister would normally do, digging into the research papers, reading the science. And what struck me was that most forensic testing companies who do these drug results use the Society of Hair Strand Testers cutoff levels, which means if it's above that cutoff level, it's above that number, it's positive, it's below it, it's negative.
That only works if all hair is treated equal and all drug corresponds or incorporates into the hair in an even way. And what we know is that that is so far from the truth, that someone with the type of hair that my client had in this case has a much higher melanin content. Drugs are incorporated into the hair through melanin, and he's got 100 times more than someone with red hair, for example. So the same person using the same amount of drugs may produce clear results, and someone else will have a result in a standard drug test that will have an H next to it, indicating high. Now, those results, how high, medium, and low in of themselves, are utterly misleading, because it doesn't correspond with the amount of drug a person's used, just corresponds with the data that their testing companies have on their books. In this case, had that not been challenged and had the research not been put to an expert, then that baby may very well have been adopted. There are, I'm sure, other cases where there have been miscarriages of justice because too much reliance has been placed on the science.
So, Paul, talk us through the science of hair sampling and these nuances that can impact the result.
Yeah, well, at the sampling stage itself, that in itself can cause all sorts of variants in the same individual. I mean, if we look at cocaine as an example, Sarah's absolutely right in what she was just describing there. If you have black hair, then your levels will be, for the same level of drug use, typically with the cocaine and opiates and things like that, 15, 20 times higher than it would be for somebody with blonde or grey or red hair. So it clearly demonstrates the frailty of this binary approach to reporting. But going back to the very collection itself, if we, for example, were to collect a sample of hair from a particular area of the scalp, say the back of the head, at the same time we were to take a sample of the hair, perhaps say from the side of the head, and test them both for cocaine, the one on the side of the head in a cocaine user is likely to be 5-10 times higher than the one on the back of the head. And as Sarah was alluding to, this high, medium and low you can find on the same person's scalp, depending on where you collect it from on the head. There's a lot of emphasis placed on the periods covered by the hair. There's been a claim that they've stopped using a particular drug, and that might be for 2 months or 3 months or whatever. Now, if there's no chain of evidence, i.e. a high definition digital photograph of the sample collection site at the time and it was removed, then there's no way of knowing what that particular sample, when it gets tested in the laboratory, covers at all. Was it cut from the end of the hair? You know, there's 3 centimetres left on the scalp. Nobody knows, because the industry don't collect this chain of evidence. And that's one little piece of chain of evidence. There's a whole series of bits of chain of evidence that without, through the collection, the packing, the transport, the unpacking, the immobilisation of the hair so it can't slide around, all that chain of evidence is crucial. If myself as an expert is going to look at the result and think, you know, I'm going to try and make an opinion on what this means, I can't. But again, this very sort of rough binary approach could produce a positive test. Yes, you've used during this period to that period, when in fact this person hasn't used at all during that period. And as Sarah says, you know, that is going to result around the country in many courts to a very serious miscarriage of justice. Outside of the miscarriage of justice, which in itself we have to address, is the significant costs associated. One of the things we face in this industry when we go into some of these cases is, oh no, we can get a cheaper test down the road with a different company. The upshot of that in some of these cases will be that miscarriage of justice, and there will be an adoption, and the downstream cost of that long term, outside of the sheer chaos that causes in a family and to the child and everything else, is hundreds of thousands of pounds. So saving their £90 or their £100, you know, there's so much emphasis on cost, and the emphasis is on cost because this is seen as a drug test. Everybody does this drug testing, get the cheapest test, if you like, and that drives the appetite of the industry to do less and less in terms of their investigative work, so they can get more business. It's a big problem, and particularly when the scientists who are presenting some of this evidence have known about factors such as the one Sarah mentioned on the heat treatment. A particular outcome in 2019 got publicised, but we've known for tens and tens of years that you heat cocaine and it produces AEME. So anybody interpreting a result that sees AEME has to make a determination as to whether or not this contamination of the hair that may have occurred, has it been exposed to heat or not? And that's a part of the investigation that's crucial in every case.
In my case, what saved the day was a nail test, because the hair strand test was so complicated that I said, well, we need to get a nail test. And that demonstrated there had been no cocaine found in the nail for the whole of the testing period, which was like well over 6 months. And that was entirely inconsistent with the hair strand results. It was that cost, that additional cost of doing it properly, getting an additional test in a different way, that led to that case being resolved satisfactorily. Spend a bit of money to save a lot of money, I think, is the key point
Absolutely.
of that.
I think that's a really good point. Well made. It's just such an ongoing problem that shaving pennies and pounds at the front end is causing absolute chaos.
If I can play devil's advocate just for a moment, we have to draw the line in the sand somewhere. There has to be I'll call it binary, a binary yes or no somewhere in the sand, doesn't there, Paul?
I think the yes or no in terms of the judgment is to be made by the judge in the court, or indeed by those in the pre-proceedings deciding whether or not, on the balance of what the evidence is telling us from this particular science and all the other things we know, do we have the ability to manage the risk that's been presented? Do we understand the risk? If we don't understand the risk, then perhaps we don't, and that's got to go further. In terms of yes or no, this evidence won't give a yes or no. What it will do is provide evidence that can be very compelling, in which case it can have a very strong leverage on the particular decision, because all factors are pointing to what else could it be. Very little could explain this other than this person using this particular drug during that particular period to sort of a balance. If nothing else, we've looked at this evidence, it's not able to give us the information we need for us to make a decision. The benefit of that is you've tried, you've failed, but it's not going to mislead the court and it won't produce a miscarriage of justice. I think the courts and the judiciary and all those working in it have to appreciate that this type of evidence will help to a greater or lesser extent in a high proportion of cases. But what we must do as experts who provide this evidence and communicate it, we must not mislead the courts. And if I was to apply the industry cutoffs to a whole range of the testing we do, I know take cannabis, for example, 60% of cases I will be misleading the court if I applied a cutoff to our results. 20% of cases on cocaine, I'd be misleading the court. So I know that. To be fair, the industry know that because they know all the various influences, etc. So I think we have to move away from this idea of this is the definitive, this is the holy grail, as it was described to be by some magistrates when I did some training with them. Oh no, you sort of burst the bubble. We thought this was the holy grail. But we have to present it as what it is, not as what we'd like it to be.
And that makes your job a bit more challenging, Sarah.
It does if you're trying to achieve fairness. Lawyers and judges in particular are always really grateful to be presented something that looks straightforward, to be given the answer. It's our job to shake that up and to challenge it, to say it isn't the answer. And that's why we're so keen to provide this training and this understanding about the limits of this form of testing, both in terms of what we know about the difficulties with hair growth, with growth rate, like Paul was talking about, testing periods of time. And we often ask for that sectional monthly analysis. The hair's cut into monthly chunks and then tested to see whether someone has, been abstinent from drugs for as long as they claim. But of course, there's obvious difficulties with that because we know Afro-Caribbean hair grows much more slowly than Caucasian hair. And that you have these sort of triple whammies where the person with the wrong type of hair is falls foul. I had a case, a good 10 years ago where I cross-examined the expert on growth rate because they were saying this person is not abstinent when they've said they claim to be. it should never be taken as holy grail, as black and white. It should always be looked at in context, and often is, especially the sort of standard tests that we receive, capable of challenge, and that's what we need to do. Makes us unpopular, especially when cases need to be finished in a speedy time frame, but it's got to be done, because we are here to try in the best way we can to get to the truth.
I think it goes all the way back to the way in which this evidence is instructed. If we're approached as experts, then we will ask all the background information we need to know about that particular case. We will do all the necessary work, we'll collect all the necessary influences, context, we'll speak to social worker if necessary to get some context, we'll look at longer pieces of hair, or as Sarah was saying, we use nail testing frequently in addition to the hair, to give us additional context that enables us to interpret it more reliably. And I think if the courts are approaching an expert and be led by that particular advice, this evidence won't help, or it will. This is what we need to do, and go through what they call a instruct an expert application. And that expert can then very accurately describe exactly what they're going to do, the questions they're going to look to answer. Then I think working more closely as part of the process, as opposed to some laboratory who just tests and throws something out, will actually move us closer to the courts understanding the evidence and being able to make decisions on it as a consequence.
There's a Donald Rumsfeld moment in the midst of our discussion today, which is that there are known knowns, there are unknown knowns, there are known unknowns, and unknown unknowns was one of the phrases I heard said. And I guess the issue here is that there's lots of things that we know about the science, there's lots of things that we do know about hair testing and nail testing, but it still strikes me that there's a huge amount of stuff that we simply don't know. And that's the gap between the cracks, isn't it, Paul, that we simply just don't understand all of that to make drug testing as definitive as the courts might like it to be. It's been really, really interesting to have you both on the podcast, and I think that particular case that you've talked about, Sarah, is really enlightening. So thank you very much indeed to the both of you for sharing your insight.
Thank you.
Thank you.
The Today's Family Lawyer podcast is available on your preferred podcast provider. It's also available on todaysfamilylawyer.co.uk. My thanks to Paul and also to Sarah. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you again soon.
You're listening to the Today's Family Lawyer podcast, the leading source of daily news and insight for family law practitioners in England and Wales. Sign up to our free weekly newsletter at todaysfamilylawyer.co.uk and subscribe to hear all the latest news and views from across the family law sector. You can also follow us on LinkedIn and Twitter.